Imagine a time when England was fractured, a kingdom teetering on the edge of chaos. Noble families were locked in a bitter struggle for the crown, loyalties shifted overnight, and the throne seemed almost cursed. This was the era of the Wars of the Roses, a civil war that spanned decades, leaving behind a trail of blood, betrayal, and shattered dynasties. Amid the turmoil, one woman's quiet, relentless determination changed the course of history. Margaret Beaufort, a name often overshadowed by kings and battles, was the force behind the rise of the Tudor dynasty. She navigated treacherous political waters, secured her son's claim to the throne, and shaped the future of England in ways that few could have imagined. Her story is not just about survival, but about strategy, foresight, and the intricate art of turning opportunity into power. From her early years, marked by marriage, widowhood, and the constant threat of political annihilation, to her role in orchestrating alliances and cultivating supporters, Margaret Beaufort exemplified the careful, calculated influence that shaped a dynasty. Through her actions, the Lancastrian line, long in decline, was revived and fused with the Yorkist claim through her son's marriage, creating a united England under the Tudors. The battles, the exiles, and the conspiracies set the stage for a dramatic climax. The victory of Henry Tudor at Bosworth Field and the birth of a dynasty that would rule for generations. Her influence went beyond politics and dynastic survival. It shaped the culture, the court, and even the moral identity of the Tudors. Understanding Margaret Beaufort is key to understanding how a single determined individual could turn a fractured kingdom into a unified realm, and how the Tudors emerged not just as rulers, but as symbols of peace and legitimacy after decades of war. Welcome to our channel. In this video, we will take you on a journey through the life of Margaret Beaufort, exploring her role in the Wars of the Roses, her tireless efforts to secure her son Henry's path to the throne, and how she helped lay the foundation for the Tudor dynasty. We'll uncover the strategies, the alliances, and the pivotal moments that made her one of the most influential women in English history. The Wars of the Roses were not just a series of battles. They were the culmination of decades of dynastic tension that shaped the political landscape of late medieval England and ultimately allowed the Tudor dynasty to emerge. The struggle between the houses of Lancaster and York was rooted in questions of legitimacy, inheritance, and authority. The Lancastrians, descending from John of Gaunt, son of Edward III, had claims to the throne that were complicated by issues of legitimacy and internal disputes. The Yorkists, in contrast, claimed descent from Lionel, Duke of Clarence, and positioned themselves as a more legitimate alternative when the Lancastrian kings faltered. This rivalry was intensified by weak monarchs, shifting alliances among the nobility, and a society structured around loyalty to powerful regional families, creating a context in which rebellion, intrigue, and armed conflict became almost inevitable. At the heart of this conflict were issues of succession and governance. The early reign of Henry VI revealed the dangers of a monarch who lacked both political skill and decisiveness. His reliance on favorites and inability to manage competing factions within the nobility weakened the Lancastrian position and opened opportunities for the Yorkists to press their claims. The first battle at St. Albans demonstrated that factional disputes could quickly escalate into open warfare, setting a precedent for decades of intermittent civil strife. Each subsequent engagement, from Towton to Barnet, reflected not only the strategic calculations of the opposing sides, but also the personal ambitions, grudges, and loyalties of influential families. Within this turbulent environment, survival often depended as much on prudence and adaptability as on martial skill, a reality that would be crucial for the Tudors' eventual success. Amid these larger forces, individual actors played decisive roles. Key Yorkist leaders, such as Edward, Duke of York, and later his son Edward IV, capitalized on Lancastrian weakness to seize the throne, demonstrating both military acumen and political shrewdness. The Lancastrian cause, meanwhile, relied heavily on figures such as Margaret of Anjou, whose determination to protect her son's inheritance provided a rallying point for loyalists, even when the odds were against them. The Beaufort family, and particularly Margaret Beaufort, represented another critical thread in this narrative. Though her son Henry Tudor was in exile for much of the conflict, Margaret's careful management of her estates, alliances, and communications ensured that when an opportunity arose, Henry could act decisively. Her position illustrates how dynastic struggles were not only fought on the battlefield, but also in marriage negotiations, court politics, and the careful cultivation of support among influential families and foreign powers. The prolonged instability of the Wars of the Roses also reshaped the concept of monarchy in England. The repeated deposition and restoration of kings eroded the traditional notion of hereditary right being sufficient for legitimate rule. A monarch now needed military strength, political acumen, and the support of the nobility to survive. The constant danger forced noble families to be flexible, sometimes shifting allegiances to protect their interests or to capitalize on emerging opportunities. This environment of uncertainty created openings for ambitious actors outside the immediate line of succession. Henry Tudor's eventual success was not simply the result of luck, but of careful positioning by his supporters, the exploitation of Yorkist vulnerabilities, and the strategic alliances orchestrated by his mother and other key figures. Civil war, therefore, created the conditions for a new dynasty to emerge. It weakened established power structures, exposed the limitations of the ruling house, and highlighted the importance of legitimacy and effective governance. It also underscored the value of alliances and careful planning, particularly in the case of the Tudors, whose rise depended on the ability to unite warring factions under a single banner. By the time Henry Tudor landed in England to press his claim, the cumulative effect of decades of conflict had left the Yorkist regime vulnerable, weary, and divided. Margaret Beaufort's meticulous work in cultivating support, managing estates, and navigating court politics ensured that Henry could present himself as a unifying figure capable of reconciling rival claims and establishing lasting peace. The stage was set for the culmination of these conflicts in a decisive confrontation that would reshape England's political landscape. The Wars of the Roses also influenced the cultural and symbolic aspects of Tudor rule. The trauma of civil war made the consolidation of power and the projection of legitimacy central to the Tudor project. Henry's marriage to Elizabeth of York symbolized the reconciliation of warring houses, while the promotion of a historical narrative emphasizing stability and divine favor reinforced the dynasty's claims. Margaret Beaufort's patronage of education, religion, and the arts was part of this broader effort to craft a moral and political framework for Tudor rule. Her influence demonstrated that the resolution of dynastic conflict depended as much on perception, ideology, and institutional support as on force of arms. In this way, the wars did not simply clear the path for the Tudors through destruction and opportunity, but also shaped the very way the dynasty would present itself to the kingdom. The Wars of the Roses mattered for the birth of the Tudor dynasty because they created the conditions under which an outsider with a credible claim could ascend. They tested the resilience and adaptability of noble families, reshaped ideas about legitimacy and kingship, and revealed the vulnerabilities of established powers. Henry Tudor's eventual success reflected both the strategic failures of his opponents and the careful, long-term planning of his supporters, particularly Margaret Beaufort. Her work ensured that when the final confrontation came, the resources, alliances, and legitimacy necessary for victory were in place. The Civil War, therefore, was not merely a backdrop for the Tudors' rise, but an active force that determined the possibilities and constraints of their ascent. In understanding the Wars of the Roses, one sees not only a narrative of conflict and bloodshed, but also the intricate web of social, political, and dynastic factors that allowed a new dynasty to take root and endure in England, shaping the course of the nation for generations to come. The origins of the dynastic conflict that would engulf England for decades can be traced to both familial tensions and the broader political instability of the late medieval monarchy. The rivalry between the houses of Lancaster and York was rooted in competing claims to the throne, complicated by questions of legitimacy, inheritance, and marriage alliances. The Lancastrian claim derived from John of Gaunt, son of Edward III, whose descendants included Henry VI. While legally recognized, the Lancastrian line faced internal weaknesses, particularly when Henry inherited the throne as a child. His minority created a vacuum of authority, which was filled by powerful nobles whose interests often conflicted with the crown and with one another. This allowed factions to form, and loyalties shifted frequently, sowing the seeds of civil unrest. The Lancastrians' dependence on the loyalty of influential families, such as the Beauforts, created both opportunities and vulnerabilities. The Beauforts, legitimized descendants of John of Gaunt through his relationship with Catherine Swynford, played a crucial role in supporting the Lancastrian cause, yet their status also made them targets of suspicion, particularly among those who saw their claims as weaker or contingent on royal favor. Henry VI's reign exposed the fragility of Lancastrian authority. He lacked both the decisiveness and the political skill necessary to navigate a landscape dominated by ambitious and often violent nobles. His reliance on favorites and his inability to maintain strong relationships with leading families created resentment and suspicion. Regional power structures, particularly in the north and west of England, often operated independently, with powerful nobles exercising their authority in ways that undermined royal power. These conditions meant that the crown could rarely impose order without relying on alliances and concessions, and even then, enforcement was inconsistent. The monarchy's weakness emboldened rival claimants, particularly the Yorkist faction, which had a distinct and well-founded claim through Lionel, Duke of Clarence, the second son of Edward III. This line of descent, combined with the failures of Henry's rule, allowed the Yorkists to present themselves as the more capable and legitimate alternative to a faltering king. The political and familial tensions were further complicated by the role of marriages and inheritance. Noble families, aware of the importance of securing alliances, often arranged marriages strategically, using them to consolidate power, extend influence, or settle disputes. The Beauforts exemplified this strategy. Through careful marriages, they maintained and expanded their influence while also positioning themselves as key supporters of the Lancastrian cause. Margaret Beaufort, even as a child, became part of these broader calculations, her marriage negotiations reflecting both her status as a great heiress and the wider political aims of her family. These marital alliances connected the fortunes of different factions and created intricate networks of loyalty and obligation that could be mobilized or manipulated in times of conflict. As these connections intersected with the central dispute between Lancaster and York, they heightened tensions, making reconciliation increasingly difficult and civil war more likely. The claims of the Yorkist faction rested on both legal and practical grounds. The Yorkists could trace their descent through Lionel of Antwerp, Edward III's second surviving son, giving them a claim that, in theory, outranked that of the Lancastrians. They also benefited from widespread dissatisfaction with Henry's reign, as nobles and regional magnates sought a more assertive monarch who could assert control over the fractious political landscape. The Yorkist line included experienced military leaders and politically astute individuals capable of mobilizing support and exploiting Lancastrian weaknesses. Edward, Duke of York, in particular, combined a legitimate claim with a readiness to act decisively, positioning himself as a credible alternative to a monarch whose authority had become largely nominal in the eyes of many. This combination of opportunity, ability, and legitimate dissent created the conditions for the outbreak of conflict, as the Yorkists could frame their cause as both a matter of justice and practical necessity. Economic and social conditions also contributed to the tensions that led to civil war. England was still recovering from the effects of prolonged conflict abroad, particularly the 100 Years' War, and faced internal strains related to taxation, feudal obligations, and the demands of regional governance. Nobles who were frustrated by the crown's inability to protect their interests or enforce order often resorted to private armies and localized conflict to secure their aims. These dynamics created a culture in which violence could be seen as an acceptable tool for resolving disputes, particularly when legal and institutional avenues failed. Within this environment, claims to the throne became not only theoretical arguments, but also instruments for mobilizing military support, as both Lancastrians and Yorkists sought to leverage local loyalties and personal networks to strengthen their positions. The early Beaufort influence was central to these developments. The family's wealth, strategic marriages, and ties to the Lancastrian crown made them indispensable allies, yet their position was also precarious. Being legitimized rather than born in lawful wedlock placed them in a sensitive political situation, requiring careful navigation between ambition and loyalty. Margaret Beaufort's early life illustrates this dynamic vividly. As the sole heiress of her family, she became a key figure in the broader Lancastrian strategy, even while the Yorkist faction grew in strength. The tensions inherent in this position exemplify the fragility of Lancastrian claims and the opportunities available to Yorkist challengers, demonstrating how dynastic politics extended beyond simple lineage and encompassed strategy, influence, and the careful cultivation of support. By the middle of the 15th century, England was on the brink of civil war. The combination of weak monarchy, powerful and ambitious nobility, contested claims, and economic and social pressures created a situation in which violent conflict was almost inevitable. Small skirmishes, localized disputes, and political maneuvering set the stage for larger battles, with each side seeking to consolidate power and eliminate rivals. The interplay of personal ambition, dynastic claim, and political opportunity meant that the fate of the kingdom was closely tied to the decisions of a relatively small number of influential actors. As tensions escalated, the stakes became clear. The outcome of this conflict would determine not only who sat on the throne, but also the structure of authority, loyalty, and governance across the realm. The early stages of this struggle demonstrated the complex interweaving of family, politics, and military strategy that would characterize the entire period. In this environment, every decision, alliance, and confrontation carried weight. The contest between Lancaster and York was not merely a question of who had the superior claim, but also a reflection of the broader challenges facing a kingdom struggling to maintain unity under weak leadership. The combination of dynastic legitimacy, political skill, and the ability to marshal both noble and popular support determined the early successes and failures of each faction. The Beauforts, through their wealth, marriages, and strategic foresight, became crucial players, linking the Lancastrian cause to practical opportunities for survival and resurgence. Their role, and the precariousness of their position, underscores the complexity of the conflict, illustrating how dynastic, familial, and political factors converged to push England toward civil war, setting the stage for the battles, exiles, and eventual rise of the Tudor dynasty that would follow in subsequent decades. The outbreak of open conflict in England marked the beginning of a series of engagements that would come to be known as the Wars of the Roses, a struggle that would determine the fate of the Lancastrian and Yorkist houses. The First Battle of St. Albans in 1455 is often considered the starting point of this sustained period of civil war, but it was the culmination of years of tension, factionalism, and competing claims that had been building across the kingdom. This initial battle was precipitated by disputes among the nobility over influence at court, control of the king's household, and the direction of royal policy under Henry VI. Key nobles, including Richard, Duke of York, sought to assert their authority against the perceived mismanagement and favoritism of the Lancastrian king. Their grievances were not simply personal. They reflected broader dissatisfaction with a monarchy that seemed unable to manage the competing interests of the realm effectively. When diplomacy and negotiation failed, the rival factions turned to arms, demonstrating that military force had become a legitimate tool for resolving dynastic disputes. The role of nobles during this first phase of war was crucial, as shifting alliances determined the balance of power and often dictated the outcome of engagements. Nobles were not passive participants in these conflicts, but active agents pursuing their own interests. Regional loyalties, family ties, and personal ambitions shaped decisions about whom to support, when to commit forces, and when to negotiate or defect. This fluidity meant that the war was not a simple binary struggle between Yorkist and Lancastrian forces. It was a constantly evolving network of alliances and betrayals. Some families, uncertain of who would prevail, attempted to maintain neutrality, while others aligned firmly with one faction in hopes of advancing their position. These decisions had significant consequences, as battles were often won or lost based on the timely support, or lack thereof, of key nobles. The volatility of allegiance underscored the weakness of centralized royal authority, highlighting the importance of political maneuvering alongside military strength in determining the early stages of the conflict. Queen Margaret of Anjou emerged as a central figure for the Lancastrian cause, providing leadership at a time when the king's abilities were insufficient to secure the loyalty of the realm. Her determination to protect her husband and son became a focal point for Lancastrian supporters, offering both symbolic and practical leadership. Margaret's presence reinforced the notion that the Lancastrian line could command loyalty and legitimacy even in the face of military setbacks. Her ability to rally nobles, coordinate resources, and maintain morale was critical in sustaining the Lancastrian effort during the early years of the war. Moreover, her leadership underscored the gendered dimensions of the conflict, as she assumed responsibilities that were typically reserved for male figures in military and political spheres. By taking an active role in the conflict, Margaret not only strengthened the Lancastrian position, but also demonstrated the importance of leadership and strategic vision in determining the survival of a faction during this volatile period. Edward, Duke of York, and later his son Edward, who would become king, capitalized on these weaknesses to rise to prominence. Edward's political skill, combined with the military victories of Yorkist forces, allowed him to assert control over the kingdom despite ongoing resistance. The decisive Battle of Towton in 1461 marked a turning point, as the Yorkists secured a significant victory that enabled Edward to claim the throne as Edward IV. Towton demonstrated the scale and intensity of the conflict, as well as the lethal stakes involved for both factions. The victory not only established Edward's authority, but also reshaped the political landscape, forcing Lancastrian supporters into exile or submission. It highlighted the capacity of military organization, strategic leadership, and the exploitation of weaknesses in rival factions to alter the course of dynastic struggle. Towton also signaled the beginning of a period in which the Yorkist line could consolidate power, though the threat of Lancastrian resurgence. The impact of these early battles on Lancastrian supporters was profound. Families such as the Tudors and Beauforts, who had long been allied with the Lancastrian cause, faced the immediate consequences of Yorkist ascendance. Many were forced to navigate a dangerous political landscape in which loyalty to the previous king could be punished by the loss of estates, titles, or personal safety. For the Tudors, including Margaret Beaufort, these years required careful management of alliances, property, and influence, often from a position of relative weakness or exile. The Beaufort family, despite their ties to the Lancastrian line, had to reconcile the need to preserve their status with the practical realities of Yorkist dominance. These pressures underscored the high stakes of political allegiance and demonstrated that dynastic survival depended as much on strategic foresight and adaptability as on military success. During this phase, the shifting balance of power forced both factions to refine their strategies. The Lancastrians, though weakened by battlefield losses, remained a persistent threat due to their loyal supporters and the potential for foreign aid or internal revolt. The Yorkists, while triumphant in major engagements, faced ongoing challenges in securing the loyalty of powerful nobles and managing a kingdom that had been deeply divided by civil strife. The interplay between military campaigns, political negotiation, and alliance building shaped the character of the conflict and foreshadowed the prolonged struggle that would continue for decades. Both sides had to contend with the unpredictable nature of noble loyalty, the challenges of logistics and financing military operations, and the broader social consequences of war, including disruption to local governance and the burden on peasantry and towns. In addition to battles and political maneuvering, the early phase of the conflict demonstrated the importance of symbolism, propaganda, and perception in shaping loyalty and legitimacy. Both Yorkists and Lancastrians sought to frame their cause in moral and legal terms, emphasizing the justice of their claims and the failings of their opponents. Public proclamations, heraldic displays, and alliances were carefully orchestrated to reinforce the narrative of rightful rule. These strategies were critical in an era when legitimacy was contested not only on the battlefield, but also in the minds of subjects and potential allies. The use of such measures reflects the sophisticated understanding of politics and communication among the leaders of the period, highlighting that success depended on more than martial prowess alone. By the end of this phase, England had been transformed by the first major engagements of the Wars of the Roses. The initial battles established patterns of conflict, demonstrated the lethal consequences of misjudged loyalty, and revealed the capacity of determined and strategic leaders to seize control even in a fragmented political landscape. The Yorkist ascendancy under Edward IV created new dynamics that would continue to challenge Lancastrian supporters, requiring careful navigation and planning for those committed to the restoration of their line. Families like the Tudors, under the guidance of Margaret Beaufort, began laying the groundwork for the eventual resurgence of their cause, preparing for a future opportunity to reclaim authority. The interplay of military success, noble allegiance, and strategic leadership during this first phase set the stage for the prolonged struggle that would define the Wars of the Roses and ultimately shape the conditions under which the Tudor dynasty could emerge. The careful management of alliances, the cultivation of loyalty, and the perseverance of key Lancastrian figures all contributed to creating a fragile but enduring framework for the continuation of the struggle, illustrating that the resolution of this early phase would have lasting consequences for England's political trajectory and for the fortunes of those who had been marginalized by Yorkist victories. Edward IV's ascension to the throne marked a new chapter in England's long period of dynastic struggle, yet his kingship was far from secure. His initial consolidation of power depended not only on military victories, but also on the careful negotiation of loyalties among the nobility, whose shifting support could determine the stability of his reign. The Yorkist king inherited a kingdom still fractured by civil war, with many nobles uncertain of where their best interests lay and others openly resentful of his rise. Establishing authority required a combination of patronage, political acumen, and the enforcement of royal prerogatives. Edward relied heavily on trusted allies to secure key positions in government and to manage regions where noble resistance could undermine his authority. The success of these measures was uneven, as the balance between rewarding loyalty and avoiding alienation was delicate, and missteps could provoke rebellion or defections. Consolidation, therefore, was an ongoing process that required constant attention to both the ambitions of powerful nobles and the broader currents of political allegiance. One of the most influential figures in shaping Edward's early reign was Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, often called the Kingmaker. Warwick had been instrumental in Edward's rise to power, using his military and political skill to advance the Yorkist cause. However, his ambitions were not limited to supporting the king. He sought to maintain his own influence and control over the direction of royal policy. The relationship between Edward and Warwick was complex, combining mutual dependence with rivalry. Warwick's ability to manipulate factions, raise armies, and negotiate alliances made him a powerful force in his own right. Yet his growing frustration with Edward's independent decisions, particularly in matters of marriage and appointments, eventually led to a fracture between them. This tension illustrated the broader challenge Edward faced in balancing the influence of powerful nobles while asserting his own authority as king. It also reflected the unstable nature of political loyalty in this period, where personal ambition could override broader dynastic considerations. The king's decision to marry Elizabeth Woodville added another layer of complexity to his reign. This union, chosen for personal rather than political reasons, angered many members of the nobility who had anticipated a marriage that would strengthen Yorkist alliances through foreign diplomacy or the consolidation of support among English magnates. Elizabeth's family, previously of minor status, quickly rose in influence, which bred resentment and fear among established Yorkist supporters, including Warwick. The Woodville marriage altered the power dynamics at court, creating factions and intensifying rivalries. Political fallout from this decision destabilized the king's support base and opened opportunities for opponents to question his judgment and legitimacy. It also forced Edward to navigate carefully the competing demands of his own family, the nobility, and the broader political context, highlighting the interconnected nature of personal decisions and dynastic politics. As Edward sought to solidify his authority, the shifts in support between Yorkist and Lancastrian factions remained a persistent challenge. Many nobles had pragmatic approaches to allegiance, supporting whichever side appeared strongest at a given moment. This fluidity meant that Edward had to remain vigilant in maintaining loyalty through both incentives and coercion. The Yorkist regime was not monolithic. Internal divisions and the ambitions of individual nobles required careful management. At the same time, Lancastrian supporters, though weakened by earlier defeats, were not eliminated and continued to represent a latent threat. These factions could exploit dissatisfaction or miscalculation to regain influence, keeping Edward in a state of continual political negotiation. The dynamic illustrates the ongoing uncertainty of the period and the ways in which military victory alone was insufficient to ensure lasting control over the kingdom. Within this turbulent political environment, figures such as Margaret Beaufort had to navigate loyalties with extraordinary care. As a Lancastrian supporter whose son represented a potential challenge to the Yorkist throne, her survival depended on discretion, strategic alliances, and careful management of her estates and connections. Margaret understood the importance of patience and timing, maintaining relationships that could be leveraged when opportunities arose for the Lancastrian cause. Her position was emblematic of the broader challenges faced by those on the losing side of civil conflicts. Survival required balancing caution with engagement, preserving influence without provoking direct confrontation, and preparing for eventual opportunities to reclaim political relevance. Her ability to maneuver effectively during Edward's reign would prove crucial in the years to come, ensuring that the Lancastrian line remained a viable contender despite Yorkist dominance. Edward's consolidation of power also required attention to governance and administration. Securing control over the court, appointing reliable officials, and enforcing royal authority across England were critical to establishing the legitimacy of his reign. He relied on experienced administrators and loyal supporters to manage key regions and maintain order, recognizing that instability at the local level could quickly undermine his authority. The king's ability to combine military strength with administrative competence allowed him to project authority beyond the battlefield, reinforcing his position even as noble loyalties remained uncertain. Yet these measures were never entirely secure, as political missteps or the ambitions of influential figures could rapidly destabilize his rule. The interactions between Edward, his advisors, and powerful nobles reveal the broader structural challenges of kingship during this period. Authority was contested not only between dynasties, but also among members of the ruling faction, and the king's decisions could have far-reaching consequences for the stability of the realm. Edward's experiences illustrate how personal relationships, patronage, and strategic marriages could either strengthen or weaken the monarchy, and how the ambitions of powerful subjects shaped the possibilities available to the crown. Navigating this landscape required constant vigilance, adaptability, and the ability to balance competing demands, all of which were tested repeatedly throughout his reign. Despite these challenges, Edward IV managed to maintain control over England and establish a measure of stability, though this stability was fragile and contingent on ongoing management of alliances and rivalries. His reign demonstrated that political skill, strategic decision-making, and the careful cultivation of loyalty were as important as military success in sustaining authority. At the same time, the experiences of Lancastrian supporters, including Margaret Beaufort, underscore that even in apparent Yorkist dominance, opportunities for resurgence persisted. By carefully preserving alliances, managing estates, and remaining politically engaged, these figures ensured that the foundations for future challenges to the Yorkist rule were laid. This duality, the king consolidating power while opponents quietly prepare for future opportunity, characterized Edward's reign and set the stage for the ongoing struggle that would continue until the eventual rise of the Tudor dynasty. Edward's kingship, therefore, can be understood as a complex negotiation between authority and influence, military strength and political skill, loyalty and ambition. The interplay between his decisions, the ambitions of figures like Warwick, and the cautious maneuvers of Lancastrian supporters created a dynamic and often unstable political environment. The Yorkist consolidation of power, while impressive, was continually tested by the residual strength of the Lancastrians and the personal ambitions of influential nobles. Margaret Beaufort's careful navigation of loyalties during this period exemplifies the patience, foresight, and strategic thinking required to survive and maintain influence amid civil unrest. Her example highlights the broader dynamics at play in Edward's reign. The fragile balance between victory and vulnerability, authority and challenge, and the ever-present possibility that the political landscape could shift with unexpected speed, shaping the future course of English history and the eventual path toward the Tudor dynasty. The stability of Edward IV's reign was dramatically disrupted in the early 1470s by the actions of his former allies, most notably Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, and Edward's own brother, George, Duke of Clarence. Their dissatisfaction with Edward's independent decision-making, particularly his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, as well as their own political ambitions, led to a dramatic betrayal that destabilized the Yorkist position. Warwick, once a key architect of Edward's rise, grew increasingly frustrated with the king's refusal to follow his counsel, while Clarence resented being passed over for influence and favors he believed were his by right. Together, they orchestrated a revolt that temporarily removed Edward from power and allowed for the brief readeption of Henry VI, who had been largely sidelined and incapacitated by years of weak rule. This period of readeption, though short-lived, underscored the fragility of monarchical authority when noble support could shift so decisively and illustrated the enduring appeal of the Lancastrian claim, even after years of apparent Yorkist dominance. The restoration of Henry VI relied heavily on the support of Warwick, whose military skill and influence among key factions made the reinstallation of the Lancastrian king possible. Warwick's orchestration of the rebellion demonstrated not only his own ambition, but also the persistent divisions within the Yorkist ranks. His ability to manipulate political and military resources highlighted the continued significance of individual nobles in shaping national outcomes. Clarence's role further emphasized the personal dimension of loyalty and betrayal. As Edward's brother, His defection revealed the deep fractures that could exist even within the ruling family, making the restoration of Henry both a political and symbolic event. Though Henry's physical and mental condition limited his ability to rule effectively, his reappearance on the throne provided a rallying point for Lancastrian supporters and a reminder that dynastic conflict was far from resolved. The brief Lancastrian restoration set the stage for a series of critical confrontations that would determine the trajectory of the Wars of the Roses. The battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury in 1471 were decisive in reasserting Yorkist dominance and extinguishing much of the Lancastrian leadership. At Barnet, Edward returned from exile with a reorganized force, exploiting weaknesses in Warwick's strategy and ultimately defeating the rebel forces. Warwick's death in the battle marked the end of one of the most formidable challenges to Edward's reign and demonstrated how quickly fortunes could change in a conflict dominated by both military prowess and strategic miscalculation. Tewkesbury followed soon after, with Edward and his commanders confronting remaining Lancastrian forces under the leadership of Queen Margaret of Anjou and her supporters. The battle was decisive in extinguishing the immediate Lancastrian threat, culminating in the death of Henry's son, Prince Edward. The loss of the heir effectively ended the strong Lancastrian line, removing a focal point for loyalist hopes and solidifying Edward's position on the throne. The consequences of these battles were profound for the Lancastrian cause. The deaths of Prince Edward and key leaders created a vacuum in the Lancastrian leadership and significantly weakened the faction's capacity to organize resistance. Queen Margaret, though resilient and politically astute, faced the challenge of defending her remaining supporters and maintaining a claim for her son. For families aligned with the Lancastrian cause, including the Beauforts and Tudors, the Yorkist victories meant that survival required careful navigation, often through strategic withdrawal, secrecy, and the cultivation of alliances abroad. Margaret Beaufort's ability to safeguard her son, Henry Tudor, during this period exemplifies the combination of prudence and foresight necessary for dynastic survival. By securing Henry's safety and preparing for eventual opportunities to challenge Yorkist dominance, she ensured that the Lancastrian legacy could continue, even when the immediate prospects for restoration seemed bleak. Henry Tudor's exile during this period was crucial for his long-term survival and eventual rise. Removed from immediate danger in England, he spent formative years in Brittany and France, protected by foreign allies sympathetic to the Lancastrian cause. This exile allowed for the careful cultivation of support, the establishment of connections with influential figures, and the development of a sense of legitimacy that would later underpin his claim to the throne. While separated from the main theater of conflict, Henry's position as the last male Lancastrian claimant ensured that he remained a symbol for those opposed to Yorkist rule. The management of his safety, along with the maintenance of connections to loyal supporters, demonstrated the importance of long-term strategy in a period dominated by unpredictable and often violent shifts in power. The readeption of Henry VI also highlights the broader instability of English politics during this phase of the Wars of the Roses. Even a king restored to power with apparent support from influential nobles could not exercise effective authority without commanding loyalty from a wide range of factions and ensuring the cooperation of regional magnates. The brief restoration illustrated the limitations of dynastic claims unaccompanied by personal strength, strategic alliances, and military capability. The speed with which Edward returned, decisively defeated the rebels, and reasserted his authority demonstrates how tenuous any regime could be in a context where the balance of power depended heavily on the ambitions and loyalties of a small number of key actors. This period also underscores the human cost and the unpredictability of civil conflict. Battles such as Barnet and Tewkesbury were not merely strategic contests, but involved significant loss of life, the elimination of entire lines of succession, and the displacement of families whose fortunes had been tied to the success or failure of one faction. The physical and political survival of individuals like Henry Tudor became critical to the possibility of future claims. The deaths of prominent figures, particularly heirs such as Prince Edward, reshaped the landscape of legitimacy and power, leaving openings for new actors to emerge. In this context, survival, strategy, and foresight were as important as military skill in determining who would ultimately shape the future of the kingdom. The restoration and subsequent defeat of Henry VI also had long-term implications for the Lancastrian cause. While Yorkist dominance was reaffirmed, The persistence of exiled claimants such as Henry Tudor ensured that the conflict was not fully resolved. These developments created the conditions for a protracted struggle that would eventually culminate in the opportunity for a new dynasty to rise. Margaret Beaufort's careful management of her son, combined with ongoing alliances and support networks, maintained the viability of the Lancastrian line and preserved a foundation upon which future political action could be taken. Her strategic acumen during this tumultuous period exemplifies the importance of cautious, deliberate action in securing dynastic continuity amid the uncertainties of civil war. The events of this period, therefore, illustrate the interplay between betrayal, military engagement, and dynastic survival. The temporary restoration of Henry VI, the battles that reasserted Yorkist dominance, and the exile of Henry Tudor all reflect the volatility of political power in England at the time. They demonstrate that the resolution of civil conflict depended on more than battlefield victories alone. It required careful navigation of alliances, foresight in protecting heirs, and the ability to exploit the vulnerabilities of rivals. For the Tudors and their supporters, these experiences laid the groundwork for future resurgence, ensuring that the Lancastrian cause remained alive even in apparent defeat. The consequences of this period would resonate for decades, shaping the conditions under which Henry Tudor could eventually return to claim the throne and establish the Tudor dynasty as a unifying force after decades of civil unrest. Following the disastrous defeat of Lancastrian forces at Tewkesbury, the last surviving male heir of the line, Henry Tudor, was forced into exile. He spent the next decade and more in Brittany and France, under the protection of rulers who had an interest in maintaining a claimant to the English throne. During this period, Henry's survival depended not only on foreign hospitality, but also on careful management of his image, legitimacy, and potential alliances. Though removed from the battlefield, he was not removed from political significance. His presence in exile served as a focal point for those still loyal to the Lancastrian cause, even as Yorkist dominance seemed unassailable. The geography of his exile provided both security and opportunity. Brittany and France were close enough to England to maintain communication with sympathizers, but distant enough to prevent immediate danger from Yorkist forces. Henry's life in these courts was shaped by diplomacy, observation, and careful cultivation of support, allowing him to remain a potential threat to the Yorkist monarchy while ensuring his own safety. During this period, Margaret Beaufort played a central role in ensuring that her son remained a viable contender. Her political maneuvering was cautious but effective. She carefully maintained connections with both domestic and foreign allies, managing her estates and influence to avoid provoking Yorkist suspicion while keeping the Lancastrian cause alive. Margaret's strategy relied on patience and timing, recognizing that immediate confrontation with the Yorkist regime would be suicidal, but that opportunities for resurgence could emerge if loyalties and circumstances shifted. She also had to balance her personal safety and the security of her property with the need to advocate for her son's interests. Through careful correspondence, negotiation, and discreet cultivation of support, Margaret preserved the Lancastrian line's presence in the political consciousness of England and its neighbors, ensuring that Henry Tudor could later claim the throne with a measure of legitimacy and support already in place. Meanwhile, Yorkist dominance under Edward IV was increasingly consolidated, and the kingdom appeared, at least superficially, to be unified under a strong and decisive monarch. Edward's victories, administrative reforms, and ability to command loyalty among key nobles made the Yorkist regime seem secure. Yet beneath this surface, tensions persisted. The Yorkist court was far from monolithic, and the ambitions of nobles, especially those with grievances or unfulfilled expectations, created the potential for unrest. Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had already altered the political balance, giving rise to the powerful Woodville faction, whose rapid rise in influence caused resentment among established nobility. This division between the new Woodville allies and the older Yorkist supporters introduced ongoing instability and made it clear that the monarchy's hold on power depended not only on military strength, but also on careful management of court politics and noble loyalties. The Woodville faction's influence exacerbated tensions with the traditional nobility, who saw their own positions threatened by the sudden prominence of a family previously of lower rank. Disputes over marriage alliances, appointments, and access to the king intensified factionalism at court. Some nobles, alienated by the Woodville's rapid ascent, considered aligning themselves with alternative claimants or maintaining ambivalent positions to hedge against potential Yorkist failures. These internal divisions provided hope, however faint, to supporters of the Lancastrian line, who observed the dissatisfaction and unrest within the Yorkist regime and understood that opportunities might arise for Henry Tudor to assert a claim. The political climate thus remained dynamic, with no faction entirely secure and the potential for sudden shifts in allegiance a constant factor in the balance of power. Despite the apparent strength of Yorkist rule, Lancastrian hopes persisted, sustained in part by the figure of Margaret Beaufort and in part by the symbolic presence of Henry Tudor himself. Supporters who remained loyal to the Lancastrian cause, though scattered and cautious, continued to monitor events, maintain connections, and prepare for a possible return. These hopes were fragile, dependent on careful timing, the exploitation of Yorkist vulnerabilities, and the persistence of key loyalists. Even in exile, Henry Tudor was positioned as the embodiment of these hopes, a symbol around which discontented nobles and foreign powers could rally. The ongoing potential for support gave substance to the idea that the Lancastrian line could be restored, and it maintained pressure on the Yorkist monarchy to manage both domestic politics and the threat of foreign intervention. The political environment of the late 1470s and early 1480s was therefore a complex interplay of dominance and vulnerability. Edward's victories and strong administration provided a veneer of security for the Yorkists, but factional rivalries and dissatisfaction created openings that careful actors could exploit. Margaret Beaufort's skillful navigation of this landscape ensured that Henry Tudor remained a viable contender, with allies prepared to act when the right opportunity arose. Her efforts involved a combination of secrecy, diplomacy, and the cultivation of legitimacy, all of which were essential in a context where overt action could provoke immediate retaliation and danger. Exile also allowed Henry Tudor to grow into his role as the figurehead of the Lancastrian cause. Removed from immediate threat, he could learn from his surroundings, observe the political maneuvering of both domestic and foreign courts, and develop a sense of legitimacy that would later underpin his claim. Exposure to continental politics, the intricacies of courtly conduct, and the lessons of past defeats informed his understanding of kingship and strategy. This period of preparation was critical, allowing Henry to emerge not merely as a claimant, but as a poised and capable leader capable of uniting rival factions upon his eventual return. The careful management of his reputation, coupled with the cultivation of potential supporters both within England and abroad, ensured that the Lancastrian cause remained alive even in the apparent dominance of the Yorkist regime. The dynamics of this period illustrate the enduring importance of strategy, patience, and the management of perception. Yorkist dominance was not absolute, and the dissatisfaction among certain factions, combined with careful efforts by loyalists, meant that opportunities for resurgence remained possible. The delicate balance of power, the persistence of rival hopes, and the careful positioning of Henry Tudor and his supporters exemplify the complex interplay of military, political, and dynastic factors that characterized the Wars of the Roses. Margaret Beaufort's vigilance, strategic foresight, and management of her son's safety were central to ensuring that the Lancastrian line could continue, preparing the foundation for future action that would ultimately alter the course of English history. By the early 1480s, the stage was set for renewed contestation. The Yorkist regime, while strong, faced ongoing challenges due to factionalism, dissatisfaction, and the presence of a legitimate rival in exile. Henry Tudor's careful cultivation of support and Margaret Beaufort's unceasing political management meant that, even in a period of apparent Yorkist consolidation, the possibility of Lancastrian resurgence remained real. This delicate interplay of power, influence, and preparation demonstrates that the Wars of the Roses were not determined solely by military success, but also by the skill with which exiled and domestic actors navigated a shifting political landscape. The experiences of Henry and his mother during this period illustrate the patience, foresight, and resilience required to maintain dynastic hope in the face of prolonged adversity, setting the conditions for the eventual return that would redefine the English monarchy and lay the foundation. The death of Edward IV in 1483 triggered a sudden and severe crisis in the English monarchy, revealing the fragility of Yorkist authority despite decades of consolidation. His heir, Edward, then a boy of 12, was not in a position to rule, leaving a power vacuum that invited intervention from the most ambitious and influential figures at court. The natural course of succession placed the young Edward as king, But the absence of an experienced adult to govern opened the door to manipulation by those who sought control over the throne's resources and decisions. Among these figures, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, Edward's younger brother, emerged as the most decisive actor. His position as a senior male Yorkist, combined with control of armed forces and regional influence, allowed him to assert authority over the succession, setting in motion events that would destabilize the kingdom and profoundly alter the perception of Yorkist legitimacy. Richard's usurpation was justified through a series of claims regarding the illegitimacy of Edward V and the supposed improprieties of his parents' marriage. These arguments, whether entirely convincing or politically convenient, provided a rationale for declaring Edward ineligible and assuming the crown for himself as Richard III. By bypassing the rightful heir, Richard dramatically altered the accepted line of succession and revealed the vulnerability of a monarchy dependent on both legal claims and noble support. His seizure of power was not merely a personal ambition, but also reflected the broader instability of a kingdom in which factional loyalty, military strength, and opportunity could outweigh formal hereditary claims. The speed and decisiveness of Richard's actions underscored the precariousness of Edward V's position and the fragility of Yorkist legitimacy, highlighting the ease with which internal divisions could be exploited. The fate of the young Edward V and his brother Richard, known historically as the Princes in the Tower, became one of the most enduring and tragic elements of this period. Their disappearance following their confinement in the Tower of London created a profound sense of unease and suspicion throughout the kingdom. While the precise details remain unclear, their removal effectively eliminated immediate Yorkist heirs who could challenge Richard's authority. The uncertainty surrounding their fate contributed to widespread disillusionment with the Yorkist regime, particularly among those who had supported Edward IV and hoped for continuity through his offspring. Nobles, courtiers, and the broader population recognized that the established order had been subverted, and many began to question the stability and moral legitimacy of the ruling house. This disillusionment created openings for alternative claims to the throne and generated a climate in which political maneuvering became both more urgent and more dangerous. Within this atmosphere, the discontent of the nobility played a critical role. Many who had supported the Yorkists during Edward IV's reign now found themselves uncertain about their position, loyalty, and prospects. The Woodville family, closely associated with the previous king, faced marginalization and, in some cases, direct threat, as Richard sought to neutralize rival influences and consolidate power. These shifts in court dynamics illustrated the volatility of allegiance during periods of political crisis. Nobles were forced to reassess their commitments, balancing the need for survival with the potential benefits of supporting alternative claimants. In many cases, the moral shock and practical implications of Richard's actions prompted a reconsideration of previously fixed loyalties, creating a fertile environment for the emergence of new political coalitions. The uncertainty and disillusionment generated by Richard's seizure of the throne significantly strengthened the position of exiled claimants, such as Henry Tudor. Henry's status as the last surviving male Lancastrian heir, combined with his foreign protection and careful cultivation of allies, positioned him as a credible alternative to a Yorkist regime that now appeared both unstable and morally compromised. The perception of Richard as an usurper, compounded by the disappearance of the princes, lent legitimacy to Henry's claim in the eyes of many disaffected nobles and foreign powers. Although still in exile, he became the focal point for those dissatisfied with the current monarchy, and his potential to unite various factions under a single banner grew more plausible. Margaret Beaufort's ongoing management of her son's position ensured that he remained a viable contender, maintaining communications, cultivating alliances, and preparing for the eventual opportunity to press his claim. This period also demonstrates the critical importance of perception and legitimacy in monarchical rule. Richard's seizure of power, while effective in a short-term sense, undermined broader confidence in the Yorkist dynasty. The disappearance of the princes, coupled with rumors and political agitation, created an environment in which loyalty was uncertain and support could not be assumed. Nobles and regional magnates became increasingly attentive to both the moral and practical implications of their alliances, recognizing that continued support for a compromised regime could be dangerous. This dynamic illustrates the ways in which political authority in late medieval England depended as much on perception, trust, and moral credibility as on military strength or hereditary right. The crisis following Edward IV's death also revealed the limitations of previous Yorkist consolidation. Despite victories on the battlefield, administrative skill, and careful management of alliances, the dynasty was vulnerable to internal fractures, particularly when succession was contested or the king's heirs were too young to assert authority. Richard's decisive actions exposed the dependence of monarchical authority on the balance of noble power, the willingness of supporters to act in concert, and the risks posed by overreaching ambition. At the same time, the emergence of Henry Tudor as an alternative claimant illustrated the enduring significance of dynastic legitimacy and the capacity of exiled figures to exploit instability. The period demonstrated that the apparent strength of a ruling house could be rapidly undermined by miscalculation, internal division, or challenges to moral and legal authority. The political consequences of these events extended beyond the immediate crisis. Many nobles began quietly shifting their support toward Henry Tudor, either in anticipation of potential success or to hedge against continued Yorkist misrule. Foreign powers, recognizing the potential for instability and the opportunity to influence English politics, increasingly considered supporting the Lancastrian heir. Margaret Beaufort's skillful maintenance of connections and her careful advocacy for her son ensured that these networks remained operational, preserving the possibility of action once the political and military context became favorable. Her efforts underscore the importance of long-term strategic thinking, patience, and subtle maneuvering in periods when direct engagement. The crisis of 1483 set the stage for the final phase of the Wars of the Roses. Richard's usurpation and the disappearance of the princes destabilized the Yorkist regime and generated widespread disillusionment, creating openings for Henry Tudor and his supporters to position themselves as legitimate alternatives. The political landscape, shaped by fear, uncertainty, and fractured loyalties, allowed those prepared to act with foresight and caution to capitalize on emerging opportunities. Margaret Beaufort's careful management of her son's claim, combined with the latent dissatisfaction among English nobles, ensured that the Lancastrian line remained viable despite the apparent triumph of Richard III. The period illustrates the intricate interplay between legitimacy, perception, and strategy, showing that the path to power required both patience and a readiness to act decisively when conditions became favorable. The crisis following Edward IV's death was not merely a moment of upheaval, but a turning point that highlighted the vulnerabilities of established authority, the enduring importance of dynastic claims, and the conditions that would eventually allow Henry Tudor to emerge as a unifying figure capable of ending decades of civil conflict and establishing a new dynasty. The death of Edward IV and the subsequent usurpation by Richard III created a volatile political climate in which factions quickly sought to exploit uncertainty for their own gain. Among these, the rebellion led by Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, in 1483 emerged as the first serious challenge to Richard's claim to the throne. Buckingham, a former supporter of Richard who had grown dissatisfied with the new king's actions, mobilized forces in an attempt to dethrone him and restore Edward V, or place an alternative claimant in a position of power. This rebellion was fueled by widespread discontent with Richard's seizure of the crown and the mysterious disappearance of the princes in the Tower, which had deeply undermined confidence in Yorkist legitimacy. The rebellion, though ultimately unsuccessful, signaled the vulnerability of Richard's rule and highlighted the potential for alliances that could unite Yorkist opponents with surviving Lancastrian claimants, setting the stage for Henry Tudor's eventual bid for the throne. Margaret Beaufort played a central role in shaping these early conspiracies and in linking residual Yorkist supporters to the Lancastrian cause. Her strategic insight and careful maneuvering allowed her to maintain contact with influential nobles who were dissatisfied with Richard's rule while ensuring the protection and legitimacy of her son, Henry Tudor. Margaret's network extended across England and into continental Europe, enabling her to coordinate support and cultivate alliances that would later prove decisive. She carefully navigated the treacherous political environment, balancing discretion with action to avoid attracting the attention of Richard's agents while keeping alive the hope of Lancastrian resurgence. Her efforts illustrate the importance of patient and strategic political engagement in a period when overt action could easily lead to execution or confiscation of property, and they underscore her role as a linchpin connecting the scattered hopes of Lancastrian loyalists to concrete plans for challenging Yorkist rule. The rebellion of Buckingham also emphasized the opportunity for uniting Yorkist defectors with exiled Lancastrians, an alliance that would eventually coalesce around Henry Tudor. Many nobles who had previously served under Edward IV were alienated by Richard's consolidation of power and his treatment of the Woodville family. This disaffection created openings for collaboration with surviving Lancastrians, who could present a legitimate alternative to a regime now viewed as morally compromised and politically unstable. Margaret Beaufort and other Lancastrian supporters recognized the value of leveraging this discontent to generate practical support for Henry Tudor, transforming him from a figure of symbolic hope into a focal point for active political engagement. The rebellion, though failing militarily, demonstrated that coordinated efforts could exploit Yorkist weaknesses, and that alliances between previously opposed factions were not only possible but potentially decisive. During this period, the role of Elizabeth of York became increasingly important in consolidating support for Henry Tudor. As the eldest daughter of Edward IV, Elizabeth represented the Yorkist line and offered a symbolic bridge between Yorkist discontent and Lancastrian claims. Marriage negotiations between Henry Tudor and Elizabeth of York, though initially speculative, provided a tangible mechanism for uniting rival dynastic claims, presenting the prospect of reconciliation and legitimacy that could appeal to both disaffected Yorkists and remaining Lancastrian supporters. The proposed union transformed Henry's claim from one based solely on maternal lineage into a broader platform capable of appealing to a wider array of nobles and political actors, enhancing his credibility and the potential for successful insurrection. The backing of the Woodville family for Henry Tudor further strengthened his position. The Woodvilles, marginalized and threatened by Richard's consolidation of power, had both motivation and resources to support an alternative claimant. Their networks, access to information, and connections across the nobility provided practical advantages in mobilizing support, coordinating plots, and facilitating communication with continental allies. The Woodville alignment with Henry and the Lancastrians exemplifies the fluidity of loyalty during this period, showing how personal grievances, political opportunity, and dynastic calculation could combine to create coalitions capable of challenging an established monarchy. Their participation also lent an additional layer of legitimacy, connecting Henry's cause to both the old Yorkist regime and the displaced Woodville interests. Buckingham's rebellion, although it failed to achieve its immediate objectives, served as a critical learning experience for Henry Tudor and his supporters. It revealed the practical challenges of mobilizing forces within England, the risks posed by divided leadership, and the importance of securing reliable allies before committing to direct action. Margaret Beaufort, in particular, recognized that success required patient preparation, careful timing, and the coordination of multiple interests both at home and abroad. The lessons learned during this failed uprising informed the strategies that would be employed in Henry's eventual campaign to claim the throne, emphasizing the interplay between political maneuvering, alliance building, and military planning. Following this early challenge, Henry Tudor's position as a claimant became more clearly defined and strategically actionable. His legitimacy, grounded in his descent from the Beauforts and the Lancastrian line, was strengthened by his potential marriage to Elizabeth of York, which promised to unite the claims of both houses and appeal to a broader spectrum of nobles and commoners. The exiled prince's presence in Brittany and France provided a secure base from which to plan, negotiate, and cultivate the necessary resources for an invasion. French support, motivated by both dynastic interest and strategic considerations, proved critical in providing material aid, political endorsement, and a platform from which to organize the campaign. This foreign backing increased the feasibility of Henry's bid and lent an air of credibility and inevitability to his eventual return to England. Meanwhile, Richard III's insecurity shaped the Yorkist regime's internal and external behavior. The disappearance of the princes, the ongoing discontent among nobles, and the presence of a viable alternative claimant created a climate of fear and paranoia. Richard's propaganda emphasized his legitimacy and the necessity of his rule, but it could not fully erase the perception that his seizure of the crown had been morally dubious. In response, Henry Tudor's supporters worked to exploit this insecurity by cultivating alliances, spreading awareness of his claim, and preparing the groundwork for an invasion. The contrast between Richard's defensive posture and Henry's patient consolidation of support highlighted the differing strategies of incumbent rulers and exiled challengers, demonstrating how perception, legitimacy, and strategic positioning were as important as battlefield strength in determining the potential for successful regime change. Preparations for Henry's campaign culminated in careful coordination of military, political, and dynastic elements. The planning involved the assembly of a loyal army, coordination with continental powers, and the establishment of secure lines of communication. Margaret Beaufort's role in managing correspondence, securing loyalties, and overseeing the engagement of key allies was crucial, as was the cooperation of influential figures such as the Stanley family. The Stanleys, strategically positioned within England, provided both a potential check on Richard's power and an opportunity to influence the outcome of the impending conflict. Their involvement underscores the importance of domestic support in combination with foreign aid, illustrating that successful claims required both internal legitimacy and practical enforcement. The strategic patience exercised by Henry Tudor and his supporters allowed for the alignment of various factions and interests at the critical moment. By maintaining his position in exile, cultivating alliances, and strengthening his claim through dynastic marriage, Henry created conditions in which a decisive challenge to Richard III could be attempted. This approach minimized risk while maximizing the potential for success, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of the interplay between legitimacy, perception, and military opportunity. The coordination of Lancastrian loyalists, Yorkist defectors, continental allies, and domestic supporters transformed Henry from a figure of symbolic hope into the central actor capable of executing a decisive campaign. As the plans for the invasion of England solidified, the combination of French support, domestic alliances, and strategic timing ensured that Henry Tudor's claim was not merely theoretical. The engagement of the Stanleys, the backing of disaffected Yorkists, and the enduring loyalty of Lancastrian supporters created a multifaceted coalition capable of challenging the reigning monarch. The careful orchestration of this coalition illustrates the complexity of late medieval politics, in which military operations were inseparable from alliance management, propaganda, and dynastic calculation. Margaret Beaufort's persistent involvement, ensuring communication and coordination across multiple fronts, exemplifies the behind-the-scenes work essential to preparing a successful bid for the throne. The events from Buckingham's rebellion through the preparations for Henry Tudor's campaign reveal the convergence of opportunity, strategy, and legitimacy that defined this period. Although early uprisings failed, they highlighted Yorkist vulnerabilities and demonstrated the potential for coalition building. Margaret Beaufort's guidance, Henry's secure position in exile, and the calculated involvement of key allies created the conditions for a credible challenge. The marriage alliance with Elizabeth of York added a crucial dimension, uniting rival claims and appealing to multiple factions within England. These developments culminated in a scenario in which Henry Tudor, long a figure in the shadows, could emerge as a central contender, with a coalition sufficiently broad and committed to contest the throne successfully. The stage was now set for the final confrontation that would determine the fate of the Wars of the Roses, the survival of dynastic claims, and the establishment of a new ruling house capable of uniting England under a single legitimate authority. The culmination of Henry Tudor's patient preparation came in 1485 at the Battle of Bosworth, a confrontation that would determine the fate of the English crown and bring an end to decades of dynastic warfare. The strategic context of the battle was shaped by Richard III's attempt to assert his authority in the face of a credible Lancastrian threat. Henry's forces, though smaller and less experienced than those loyal to Richard, were composed of a combination of his loyal Lancastrian supporters, disaffected Yorkists, and French contingents provided as part of the preparations during his exile. The Yorkist army, under Richard's command, was numerically superior and composed of seasoned soldiers accustomed to the turbulent conflicts of the previous decades. Yet the effectiveness of an army in this period depended not solely on size, but also on loyalty, morale, and the cohesion of leadership, all factors that would prove decisive at Bosworth. One of the critical elements in the battle was the role of Lord Thomas Stanley and his brother Sir William Stanley, whose loyalties were pivotal. Both men commanded significant forces in the field, yet their allegiance was ambiguous prior to engagement. The Stanleys had extensive influence in northwest England and could tip the balance of power decisively. They had long-standing ties to Henry Tudor through marriage and previous alliances, but the risks of openly opposing Richard remained high. Their cautious position reflects the broader uncertainty of noble allegiance during the Wars of the Roses, where decisions could mean the survival or destruction of entire families. Ultimately, their decision to intervene on Henry's behalf at a crucial moment in the battle turned the tide, demonstrating how strategic alliances and timely action were as critical as numerical strength in determining the outcome of conflict. The engagement at Bosworth was intense and brutal, characterized by close-quarter combat, cavalry maneuvers, and the leadership of both monarchs directly influencing the fighting. Richard III, renowned for his military skill, personally led charges against Henry's forces in an attempt to break the enemy line and capture the Lancastrian leader. Henry, however, remained strategically positioned, relying on disciplined formations and the coordination of his allies to absorb the Yorkist assaults. The involvement of the Stanleys at the decisive moment allowed Henry's smaller force to exploit gaps in Richard's lines, creating the conditions for a successful offensive. The personal bravery of the combatants, combined with the effective orchestration of limited resources and the exploitation of Yorkist overconfidence, determined the outcome of the day. Richard III's death during the battle marked the definitive end of Yorkist resistance and represented both a military and symbolic turning point. With the last male Yorkist monarch removed from the scene, the dynastic struggle that had defined England for decades reached a resolution. The fall of Richard also highlighted the importance of leadership on the battlefield. The loss of a single, decisive figure destabilized the command structure and morale of Yorkist forces, contributing directly to Henry's victory. The effectiveness of Henry's strategy, patient preparation, careful alliance building, and the coordination of timely intervention by key supporters was validated by the outcome, demonstrating that success in this period depended on a combination of planning, diplomacy, and tactical acumen. Henry Tudor's triumph at Bosworth established him as the uncontested King of England and inaugurated the Tudor Dynasty. The victory symbolized the unification of warring factions under a new monarch capable of reconciling rival claims. For Henry, the immediate challenge extended beyond the battlefield to consolidating power, ensuring loyalty among the nobility, and demonstrating that the transition of authority would be both legitimate and enduring. His approach combined careful acts of conciliation with decisive displays of royal authority, emphasizing the continuity of governance while marking the start of a new dynastic era. The personal survival of Henry, combined with the strategic support of his allies, allowed the Lancastrian claim to flourish, transforming decades of exile, preparation, and negotiation into a decisive moment of political triumph. Following his ascension, Henry's first acts as king were carefully designed to stabilize the realm and consolidate his authority. Recognizing the necessity of securing loyalty among nobles, he issued acts of pardon to former Yorkist supporters willing to swear allegiance, balanced by firm measures against those who posed a continuing threat. Administration, law, and governance were emphasized to project both continuity and legitimacy, reinforcing the perception that Henry's rule was both capable and just. These initial measures were instrumental in preventing the emergence of immediate rebellions and in setting the tone for the management of factional tensions that had defined previous reigns. Effective early governance was crucial in transforming a battlefield victory into sustainable monarchy. The marriage to Elizabeth of York represented a pivotal step in uniting the divided factions of England and solidifying the legitimacy of the new dynasty. By marrying the daughter of Edward IV, Henry symbolically reconciled the Lancastrian and Yorkist claims, creating a dynastic bridge that mitigated opposition and reassured nobles and subjects alike. This union produced heirs whose lineage encompassed both houses, securing a clear and uncontested line of succession. Beyond dynastic symbolism, the marriage also functioned as a political instrument, cementing alliances, reducing the risk of factional rebellion, and establishing the Tudor claim as legitimate in the eyes of both domestic and foreign powers. It exemplified the calculated use of marriage as a tool of statecraft in consolidating authority following a contested succession. Despite these efforts, challenges to Henry's rule persisted, exemplified by the Lambert-Simnel Rebellion and the Battle of Stoke in 1487. Simnel, a pretender supported by Yorkist sympathizers, symbolized the continuing desire of some factions to challenge the Tudor claim. The rebellion drew on disaffected nobles, highlighting the enduring volatility of English politics even after Bosworth. Henry's response combined military decisiveness with political shrewdness. By defeating Simnel's forces at Stoke and managing the aftermath with a combination of punishment and clemency, He neutralized immediate threats while reinforcing the perception of lawful and capable kingship. The suppression of this rebellion marked the final engagement of the Wars of the Roses, confirming the stability of Henry's authority and demonstrating the importance of both strategic foresight and measured governance in consolidating power. Consolidating Tudor legitimacy required more than military victory. It depended on establishing institutions, alliances, and narratives that reinforced the new dynasty's claim. Henry worked to integrate Yorkist nobles into his administration, balancing rewards with oversight to prevent disaffection while encouraging loyalty. He promoted legal and financial reforms to strengthen royal authority and project competence, enhancing the monarchy's credibility. The careful management of succession, particularly through the marriage to Elizabeth of York and the birth of heirs, created a clear line for the future, reducing the likelihood of contested claims. These measures collectively transformed a newly won crown into a durable monarchy capable of enduring the factional challenges that had plagued England for generations. The early Tudor period also demonstrates the interplay between diplomacy, internal governance, and dynastic strategy. By securing alliances abroad, Henry deterred foreign intervention and ensured the resources necessary to maintain stability. Domestically, his engagement with the nobility, his measured use of patronage, and his combination of firmness and clemency allowed him to integrate former opponents into the new order. The consolidation of power was therefore not a singular act, but a process that required constant attention to both the political and social dimensions of governance. Henry's ability to translate military success into lasting authority illustrates the comprehensive approach necessary for securing a newly established dynasty in a kingdom long accustomed to civil conflict. The victories at Bosworth and Stoke, combined with careful marriage alliances, diplomatic engagement, and administrative consolidation, laid the foundation for a dynasty that would rule England for generations. Henry's approach emphasized pragmatism, patience, and the integration of former rivals, creating a stable monarchy capable of unifying a divided kingdom. The symbolism of his reign, the reconciliation of Lancastrian and Yorkist claims, the establishment of a secure succession, and the creation of a governing framework that balanced authority with accommodation, helped to embed the Tudor dynasty in both the political and social fabric of England. Through these measures, the wars that had defined the previous decades were effectively concluded, replaced by a period of relative stability and dynastic continuity. Henry's success in securing the throne demonstrates the culmination of a strategy that had been centuries in development, beginning with the careful preservation of Lancastrian heirs, the patient cultivation of alliances, and the tactical exploitation of Yorkist weaknesses. The role of key figures, particularly Margaret Beaufort and the Stanleys, was crucial in translating opportunity into achievement, ensuring that the combination of legitimacy, preparation, and timely action could result in victory. The consolidation of power following Bosworth transformed Henry from an exiled claimant into a monarch capable of unifying the kingdom, demonstrating that enduring authority depends on both the exercise of force and the careful management of political, dynastic, and social networks. By the end of 1487, with the defeat of Lambert Simnel and the integration of rival factions into the new regime, the Tudor dynasty was firmly established. The combination of military prowess, strategic marriage, diplomatic negotiation, and careful governance transformed a kingdom long divided by civil war into a realm under centralized and recognized authority. The foundation laid during these formative years would support the long-term stability and expansion of the Tudor monarchy, providing a framework for subsequent generations to maintain both legitimacy and control over England. The transition from war to consolidation demonstrates the interplay between opportunity, preparation, and strategic foresight that characterized Henry's rise and the birth of a dynasty capable of enduring the turbulence of late medieval England. Following his consolidation of the throne and the suppression of immediate Yorkist threats, Henry VII pursued a cautious and deliberate approach to governance, recognizing that the stability of the Tudor dynasty depended on careful management of both the nobility and foreign relations. His rule was characterized by a combination of prudence, strategic foresight, and active engagement in political and dynastic matters. Understanding the lessons of the Wars of the Roses, Henry sought to prevent the resurgence of rival claimants and to integrate potentially rebellious nobles into a system of loyalty and oversight. The crown's authority was strengthened not solely through military might, but through financial management, legal innovation, and the cultivation of political alliances, creating a foundation for a durable monarchy. Henry's management of the nobility was particularly important, as the lingering memory of dynastic conflict meant that many lords retained private armies, local influence, and the capacity to challenge royal authority. Henry employed a variety of strategies to mitigate this threat. He carefully distributed patronage and titles to reward loyalty, while simultaneously monitoring the ambitions of the most powerful magnates. Bonds and recognizances, legal instruments requiring nobles to guarantee good behavior under threat of financial penalty, were used extensively to enforce compliance. By combining incentives with mechanisms for accountability, Henry effectively curtailed the independence of potentially rebellious lords without provoking open confrontation. This cautious, calculated approach reflected an understanding that stability required not only suppression of threats, but also the maintenance of noble cooperation within a structured hierarchy. In addition to managing domestic threats, Henry faced ongoing challenges from foreign and domestic claimants, most notably Perkin Warbeck, who posed a significant challenge by claiming to be one of the missing princes in the Tower. Warbeck attracted support from Yorkist sympathizers and foreign rulers, demonstrating that opposition to the Tudor regime remained persistent. Henry's response combined diplomacy, strategic surveillance, and military readiness. By skillfully negotiating with continental powers, containing Warbeck's support, and ultimately neutralizing the threat through capture and execution, Henry demonstrated the effectiveness of combining measured assertiveness with patient political strategy. This handling of Yorkist resurgence illustrates the careful balance required to maintain authority in the early Tudor period. Threats could not simply be defeated by force, but needed to be managed through a combination of law, diplomacy, and strategic foresight. Foreign diplomacy played a central role in reinforcing Tudor authority. Henry cultivated relationships with Spain, Scotland, and France, recognizing that England's stability was intertwined with continental politics. Alliances with Spain, solidified through the marriage of his son Arthur to Catherine of Aragon, provided both prestige and security, while negotiations with Scotland and France helped mitigate the risk of foreign support for Yorkist pretenders. Henry's approach to international relations was both pragmatic and strategic. By aligning England with powerful European states and neutralizing potential support for internal threats, he reduced the likelihood of foreign-backed insurrection and enhanced the legitimacy of his reign in the eyes of European rulers. Diplomacy thus complemented domestic governance, contributing to the consolidation of Tudor authority across multiple dimensions. Propaganda and symbolism were also critical tools in the early Tudor state. Henry actively cultivated an image of legitimacy, portraying his claim to the throne as both lawful and divinely sanctioned. Coinage, portraits, and official ceremonies emphasized the unity of Lancaster and York under the Tudor line, reinforcing the idea of dynastic reconciliation. Public rituals, the careful use of heraldry, and patronage of religious institutions communicated both stability and moral authority. The careful shaping of perception reinforced Henry's political actions, demonstrating the importance of narrative in legitimizing rule and consolidating support. By presenting the Tudor dynasty as the rightful and divinely favored rulers of England, Henry strengthened both loyalty among subjects and credibility among European powers. Within this framework, Margaret Beaufort's influence became increasingly significant. Her political acumen, understanding of dynastic strategy, and deep engagement in her son's affairs made her a key advisor and partner in the consolidation of Tudor power. Margaret's guidance extended beyond familial counsel to practical involvement in policy, negotiation, and management of noble relations. Her unique position as Henry's mother and as a surviving member of the Lancastrian line gave her authority and moral weight in matters of succession and governance. She played a central role in shaping the court's perception of the dynasty, ensuring that the legitimacy of the Tudors was reinforced both domestically and abroad. Margaret's personal piety and extensive patronage further enhanced the dynasty's moral and cultural authority. She supported religious institutions, commissioned texts and artworks, and cultivated intellectual and artistic life in England, linking the Tudor family to moral virtue and divine favor. Her piety was not merely private devotion. It was a public signal of legitimacy and stability, reinforcing the association of the Tudor line with providential approval. Patronage of scholars, clergy, and artists allowed Margaret to shape the intellectual and cultural climate of the period, embedding the dynasty within broader social and moral narratives that extended beyond political governance. This combination of moral authority, cultural influence, and dynastic strategy strengthened the dynasty's claim to continuity and reinforced its emerging identity. Margaret's partnership with Henry in political and dynastic matters was essential to the long-term consolidation of Tudor rule. She provided counsel on issues of succession, managed critical alliances, and supervised arrangements that would ensure the education and preparation of future heirs. Her experience navigating the complex politics of the Wars of the Roses informed her advice, allowing Henry to benefit from her foresight and strategy. This collaboration demonstrates the importance of family networks and experienced counsel in sustaining authority, showing that consolidation of power was not merely the result of military victory, but of careful, ongoing management of relationships, perception, and succession planning. Education of Tudor heirs was another key aspect of Margaret's influence. She ensured that her grandchildren were instructed in governance, diplomacy, moral responsibility, and religious observance, creating a new generation prepared to maintain the dynasty's legitimacy and authority. This investment in education reflected a broader strategy to secure the long-term stability of the Tudor line, emphasizing the importance of preparation and foresight in consolidating political power. By cultivating knowledgeable, capable successors, Margaret helped embed the dynasty within a framework that combined moral authority, administrative competence, and dynastic continuity. Through her efforts, Margaret also shaped the emerging identity of the Tudor dynasty as both moral and divinely favored. Her piety, patronage, and careful guidance contributed to a narrative in which the Tudors were presented not only as politically legitimate, but as morally upright and sanctioned by God. This identity reinforced loyalty among subjects, bolstered the perception of the dynasty abroad, and provided a framework for governance that emphasized both justice and continuity. Margaret's influence ensured that the Tudors were not merely winners of civil conflict, but were positioned as a morally and politically credible ruling house, capable of commanding respect, loyalty, and obedience across the kingdom. The combined impact of Henry's cautious rule and Margaret's guidance illustrates how dynastic consolidation in the early Tudor period depended on a multifaceted approach. Military victory at Bosworth and the suppression of pretenders like Lambert Simnel established the initial authority of the crown, but enduring stability required careful management of noble power, strategic alliances, diplomacy, and the cultivation of moral and cultural legitimacy. Margaret Beaufort's role in these processes demonstrates the critical importance of individual agency, experience, and foresight in sustaining dynastic success. Her influence extended across governance, succession planning, education, and cultural patronage, creating a foundation upon which Henry could build a stable and enduring monarchy. By balancing firmness with reconciliation, Henry reinforced his position as a ruler capable of integrating former adversaries while maintaining the authority necessary to prevent renewed insurrection. His administration, informed by both his experience in exile and the counsel of figures like Margaret, emphasized prudent fiscal management, legal oversight, and careful attention to both domestic and foreign relations. The integration of Yorkist and Lancastrian claims through marriage, alliance, and symbolism further solidified the perception of a united kingdom, reducing factional tensions and creating a coherent narrative of dynastic legitimacy. Margaret's continued influence ensured that these strategies were implemented effectively and sustained across successive generations. Ultimately, the Tudor consolidation of the 1480s and early 1490s demonstrates the interplay between strategic governance, noble management, foreign diplomacy, and cultural authority in establishing a new dynasty. Henry's prudence, combined with Margaret Beaufort's foresight and moral leadership, allowed the Tudors not only to survive the immediate challenges following Bosworth, but to create a lasting framework for authority and legitimacy. By embedding the dynasty within narratives of divine favor, moral virtue, and dynastic reconciliation, the early Tudors transformed a kingdom long divided by civil war into a relatively stable and centralized state, capable of projecting authority, maintaining succession, and commanding loyalty across multiple generations. The early policies and guidance of Henry and Margaret thus laid the foundations for the enduring strength and identity of the Tudor monarchy, ensuring that the lessons of the Wars of the Roses would inform governance, alliance building, and cultural influence for decades to come. The early years of the Tudor dynasty were defined not only by consolidation of power, but also by careful attention to succession and the preparation of the next generation. Henry VII's eldest son, Arthur, Prince of Wales, represented the immediate hope for continuity, and his marriage to Catherine of Aragon in 1499 was a carefully orchestrated union designed to strengthen England's dynastic and diplomatic position. Catherine, a Spanish princess, brought both prestige and strategic advantage through her connection to the powerful kingdoms of Aragon and Castile, reinforcing Henry's foreign alliances and signaling stability to both domestic and continental audiences. The marriage was intended to secure the Tudor line for decades, cementing the union of dynastic legitimacy, political prudence, and international diplomacy. Margaret Beaufort, still a guiding influence in the court, played a critical role in managing the political implications of the marriage, ensuring that the young prince's position as heir was protected and that alliances were strengthened through careful negotiation and counsel. The unexpected death of Arthur in 1502 precipitated a succession crisis that threatened the fragile stability of the new dynasty. With the eldest son gone, attention turned to Henry, Duke of York, the second surviving son, who now became the principal heir. This sudden transition demanded careful management, both politically and personally, to avoid a recurrence of instability reminiscent of the Wars of the Roses. Margaret Beaufort's guidance was central during this period, as she helped manage court expectations, navigated the concerns of domestic and foreign allies, and provided counsel to ensure that the transition did not provoke dissent or challenge from factions that might have exploited uncertainty. Her long experience with dynastic crises, strategic alliance building, and the cultivation of legitimacy allowed her to advise effectively, preserving continuity and minimizing potential threats to the young heir's claim. Preparing Henry, Duke of York, as the new heir involved more than asserting his legal position. It required careful cultivation of his education, moral authority, and political awareness. Margaret Beaufort oversaw his instruction in matters of governance, diplomacy, and moral responsibility, ensuring that he would be equipped to assume the throne with both competence and legitimacy. This preparation reflected a broader strategy for long-term dynastic security, recognizing that the survival of the Tudor line depended not only on immediate political control, but on the ability of the next generation to navigate the complex challenges of rule. By instilling knowledge, reinforcing alliances, and maintaining the moral and symbolic authority of the dynasty, Margaret helped create the conditions for continuity and the long-term durability of Tudor governance. The death of Arthur and the preparation of Henry as heir also underscored the interdependence of domestic stability and international diplomacy. The marriage of the new heir would need to reinforce alliances, secure legitimacy, and demonstrate continuity to foreign powers. Margaret Beaufort's experience with continental politics allowed her to advise on the careful selection of diplomatic connections, ensuring that England's position was secure and that the Tudor dynasty was perceived as a stable and legitimate ruling house. Her influence extended across both domestic and international spheres, illustrating the depth and scope of her strategic vision in safeguarding dynastic continuity. Through these efforts, the dynasty was able to present itself as cohesive, capable, and morally grounded, even in the face of unexpected challenges. Beyond immediate succession, the early Tudor period involved shaping the broader narrative of legitimacy and order. Henry's reign, guided by Margaret's counsel, focused on establishing the dynasty's reputation as a unifying force after decades of civil war. This involved a deliberate effort to construct a historical memory in which the Tudors were seen as restorers of stability and moral authority. Chroniclers, official records, and commissioned works played a critical role in this process, producing accounts that emphasized the legitimacy of the Tudor claim and the chaos of the preceding Yorkist rule. Margaret Beaufort's patronage was instrumental in supporting these efforts, providing resources for the production of texts, art, and religious works that reinforced the dynasty's narrative. By shaping both the historical record and cultural memory, she helped embed the Tudors within the perception of providential order and lawful kingship. Tudor propaganda after the Wars of the Roses frequently emphasized the illegitimacy and moral failings of Richard III and other Yorkist figures. The portrayal of Richard as a usurper who had seized the crown unlawfully and eliminated rightful heirs reinforced the notion that Henry's victory at Bosworth was both just and divinely sanctioned. Chroniclers such as Polydore Virgil and later historians contributed to a narrative in which the Tudors were not only victors but restorers of moral and political order. This framing helped secure loyalty among subjects, deter potential rebellion, and legitimize the new dynasty in the eyes of both domestic audiences and foreign powers. Margaret Beaufort's influence in commissioning and supporting these works ensured that the ideological foundation of Tudor legitimacy was firmly established. The shaping of historical memory also relied on selective emphasis, narrative framing, and the promotion of dynastic symbolism. Art, literature, and religious patronage reinforced the message that the Tudors were the rightful heirs to a kingdom fractured by civil war. Margaret's patronage extended to educational institutions, religious houses, and literary projects that highlighted the dynasty's moral authority, providential favor, and ability to restore unity. By investing in these symbolic and cultural tools, she helped create an enduring image of the Tudors as both legitimate rulers and moral exemplars, ensuring that the dynasty's claims would be remembered and respected by future generations. This process was essential for the consolidation of authority in a kingdom still recovering from decades of instability. The early Tudor monarchy, therefore, combined practical governance, strategic marriage alliances, and the careful cultivation of historical memory to secure long-term authority. Henry's cautious and deliberate approach, guided by the experience and wisdom of Margaret Beaufort, ensured that the dynasty could navigate challenges ranging from succession crises to external threats. By preparing the next generation, managing noble allegiances, and cultivating a perception of legitimacy and moral authority, the Tudors were able to embed themselves within the political, social, and cultural fabric of England. The combination of dynastic planning, symbolic representation, and historical framing allowed the monarchy to move beyond the immediate consolidation of power to establish an enduring presence that could withstand both internal and external pressures. Margaret Beaufort's role in this process highlights the centrality of individual agency in the survival and flourishing of dynasties. Her influence extended across governance, succession planning, cultural patronage, and the shaping of historical memory, ensuring that the Tudor claim was not only maintained but reinforced in multiple dimensions. By guiding Henry, mentoring the next generation, and overseeing the ideological framing of the dynasty's legitimacy, she provided the continuity, insight, and moral authority necessary to stabilize a kingdom still conscious of past conflict. Her actions demonstrate the importance of combining practical politics with cultural and symbolic engagement to achieve enduring dynastic security. The marriage of Henry, Duke of York, following Arthur's death, became a continuation of the Tudor strategy of dynastic consolidation through careful alliance. By linking the heirs of Lancaster and York symbolically and politically, the dynasty reinforced the narrative of reconciliation and unity that had characterized Henry VII's reign. Margaret Beaufort's involvement ensured that these alliances were not merely ceremonial, but embedded within a broader strategic framework designed to secure political stability and continuity. Her foresight in guiding these arrangements reflected her understanding of the complex interplay between marriage, succession, and legitimacy in securing the long-term survival of the dynasty. The Tudor myth, as cultivated in these years, emphasized the restoration of order after civil war and the providential sanction of the dynasty. Chroniclers and official accounts repeatedly framed the Tudors as legitimate restorers of peace and moral authority, contrasting their governance with the perceived chaos and illegitimacy of prior regimes. Margaret Beaufort's patronage of religious, literary, and artistic projects reinforced this narrative, embedding the dynasty within a broader ideological framework that linked political authority with moral and divine approval. This strategic shaping of historical memory ensured that the Tudors were not only recognized as rulers by contemporaries, but remembered as the rightful and stabilizing force in English history. In consolidating the next generation and shaping the Tudor myth, the monarchy addressed both practical and ideological concerns. Preparing Henry, Duke of York, for succession, managing alliances, and reinforcing domestic and foreign support addressed the immediate challenges of continuity and security. Simultaneously, cultivating a narrative of legitimacy, moral authority, and historical inevitability reinforced the dynasty's claim to rule and shaped perception for generations to come. Margaret Beaufort's influence was central to both dimensions, linking dynastic strategy with cultural and symbolic authority to ensure the survival, stability, and recognition of the Tudor line. The interplay of dynastic preparation, political maneuvering, and historical framing during this period created the conditions for a stable and enduring monarchy. Henry's governance, guided by caution and strategic foresight, combined with Margaret Beaufort's extensive influence, ensured that the Tudors could navigate crises, manage alliances, and prepare the next generation to assume power confidently. The cultivation of historical memory and symbolic legitimacy reinforced the authority achieved through political and military action, creating a comprehensive foundation for the dynasty's long-term security. Through these efforts, the Tudors emerged as both effective rulers and morally sanctioned leaders, able to consolidate authority, manage succession, and project a narrative of unity and providential favor across the kingdom. By embedding these strategies within governance, education, cultural patronage, and historical narrative, the early Tudor monarchy established a durable framework capable of enduring challenges both immediate and future. Margaret Beaufort's contributions ensured that the dynasty's legitimacy was continuously reinforced, the next generation was prepared, and historical memory supported the claim to rule. The combination of practical governance and ideological framing created a dynasty that could withstand opposition, manage succession crises, and maintain authority, demonstrating that the consolidation of power required attention not only to military and political factors, but also to perception, culture, and the careful shaping of historical record. The early Tudor period thus represents a synthesis of strategy, prudence, and symbolic authority, ensuring the survival and recognition of a dynasty forged through decades of conflict and careful preparation. The story of England in the 15th century is marked by decades of turmoil, conflict, and shifting loyalties, culminating in the rise of the Tudor dynasty. The Wars of the Roses, with their recurring cycles of battle, intrigue, and political maneuvering, created the conditions that made Henry Tudor's eventual ascension possible. The violent struggle between Lancaster and York left a kingdom exhausted, with nobility fractured, loyalty questioned, and the authority of the crown weakened. These circumstances, while destructive, opened opportunities for a new claimant who could present himself as a unifying figure capable of reconciling divided factions. Henry Tudor's path to the throne was shaped as much by this environment of instability as by his personal lineage, strategic marriages, and the careful counsel of influential supporters. From the earliest stages, it was clear that the Wars of the Roses had redefined the nature of dynastic politics. The succession crises, the rapid turnover of monarchs, and the shifting allegiances of nobles revealed that military prowess alone was insufficient to secure a lasting claim. Political acumen, alliance building, and the ability to navigate the treacherous networks of noble loyalty were equally essential. Figures like Margaret Beaufort understood this implicitly. Her careful management of her son's claim during periods of exile, her cultivation of both domestic and foreign support, and her skillful negotiation of marriages and alliances all exemplify the lessons learned from decades of civil conflict. The political and dynastic landscape created by the Wars of the Roses necessitated a patient, strategic approach, which Henry Tudor and his supporters executed with remarkable skill. The trajectory from civil war to dynasty was not immediate, but unfolded through a series of calculated steps, each informed by the experience of previous conflicts. Henry's exile, though a period of relative vulnerability, provided the opportunity to consolidate support, cultivate allies, and prepare for eventual action. During this time, Margaret Beaufort's influence ensured that the Lancastrian line remained viable, protecting the legitimacy of the claim and preventing the complete collapse of the family's political standing. The failures and lessons of earlier rebellions, such as Buckingham's uprising, informed subsequent strategies, demonstrating the need for careful coordination, reliable alliances, and timing of decisive action. By the time Henry returned to England to contest Richard III, he had transformed from an exiled claimant into a figure around whom a broad coalition of dissatisfied nobles and foreign supporters could rally. The Battle of Bosworth represents the culmination of these efforts, the point at which patient preparation, strategic alliances, and military opportunity converged. Henry's victory, aided by the timely intervention of figures like the Stanleys, ended Yorkist resistance and allowed the establishment of a new dynasty. Yet military success alone was insufficient to secure long-term authority. The subsequent measures undertaken by Henry, from careful management of the nobility to the integration of former Yorkist supporters, ensured that the transition of power would be durable. Marriage to Elizabeth of York symbolically and politically united the previously warring factions, reinforcing both legitimacy and stability. These actions demonstrated a profound understanding of the necessity of combining military success with political, dynastic, and symbolic strategies to consolidate power effectively. Henry's reign, therefore, represents the culmination of decades of conflict, not only in a literal sense, but also as the resolution of the structural and psychological scars left by civil war. The kingdom that Henry inherited was weary of factional fighting and suspicious of contested claims. His approach, informed by the experience of civil strife, emphasized prudence, reconciliation, and the careful cultivation of loyalty. The handling of subsequent pretenders, such as Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck, illustrates this dual approach. Decisive suppression of threats combined with careful management of noble relationships to prevent broader destabilization. Through these policies, Henry was able to transform military victory into sustainable authority, demonstrating that the establishment of a dynasty required ongoing attention to governance, perception, and strategic foresight. Margaret Beaufort's enduring influence is central to understanding the survival and consolidation of the Tudor dynasty. From her early management of Henry's claim to her ongoing involvement in court politics, she exemplified the combination of strategic insight, moral authority, and dynastic vision necessary to navigate the post-war landscape. Her patronage, both cultural and religious, reinforced the moral and symbolic legitimacy of the dynasty, linking political authority with providential favor. She also oversaw the education and preparation of future heirs, ensuring that the next generation was equipped to maintain the dynasty's claim and govern effectively. In this sense, her contributions were both immediate, in protecting her son's claim, and enduring, in shaping the long-term stability and identity of the Tudors. The early Tudor period highlights the ways in which the dynasty transformed the legacies of civil war into a framework for lasting authority. By uniting former rivals through marriage, reconciliation, and careful integration into governance, the Tudors turned divisions into a source of legitimacy rather than persistent instability. Symbolism and propaganda, championed in part through Margaret Beaufort's patronage, helped construct a narrative of moral authority, divine favor, and the restoration of order. This narrative, combined with effective administration, fiscal prudence, and diplomacy, created a sense of continuity and stability that contrasted sharply with the disorder of the previous decades. The Tudors presented themselves not merely as winners of civil conflict, but as restorers of peace, justice, and unity, fulfilling a role that the kingdom had lacked during the Wars of the Roses. The legacy of the Tudors as peacemakers and stabilizers is inseparable from the lessons of the wars that preceded them. The persistent factionalism, the fragility of dynastic claims, and the consequences of contested succession all informed the policies and priorities of the early Tudor monarchy. By understanding the causes and effects of civil conflict, the Tudors were able to implement measures that reduced the likelihood of renewed warfare, strengthened the central authority of the crown, and established enduring mechanisms of governance. These included the careful management of the nobility, the legal and financial tools to enforce loyalty, and the symbolic integration of formerly warring factions. In effect, the Tudors translated the lessons of a fractured past into policies that underpinned the long-term survival and legitimacy of the dynasty. Margaret Beaufort's role in shaping both political strategy and historical memory underscore the interplay between individual agency and structural circumstance in the survival of the dynasty. Her interventions ensured that the lineage of Henry Tudor remained recognized and respected, that key alliances were cultivated and maintained, and that the moral and symbolic authority of the monarchy was reinforced. Through patronage, cultural influence, and strategic counsel, she helped construct the narrative of the Tudors as both legitimate rulers and moral restorers of order. Her influence bridged the periods of civil war and consolidation, ensuring that the dynasty could emerge from decades of conflict not merely victorious, but stable, respected, and capable of enduring governance. Ultimately, the establishment of the Tudor dynasty represents the transformation of a kingdom long scarred by civil conflict into a realm capable of unified governance and dynastic continuity. The Wars of the Roses, despite their devastation, created the conditions for a claimant like Henry Tudor to emerge as a figure of unification. His victory at Bosworth, his strategic alliances, and his prudent policies were all shaped by the lessons of civil war, while Margaret Beaufort's guidance, patronage, and counsel ensured the survival and moral legitimacy of the new dynasty. The Tudors' ability to consolidate power, reconcile former rivals, and construct a narrative of providential authority illustrates the intricate interplay between military, political, and symbolic strategies in the establishment of enduring rule. The long-term impact of the Tudors as peacemakers and stabilizers extended beyond their immediate reign. By ending decades of dynastic conflict, establishing mechanisms for managing noble power, and embedding a narrative of legitimacy and moral authority, they created a model for effective governance that endured across generations. The careful blending of strategic foresight, dynastic planning, cultural patronage, and historical narrative ensured that the monarchy could withstand both internal and external challenges, secure succession, and cultivate loyalty across the realm. In this sense, the Tudors not only inherited the consequences of civil war, but actively reshaped them, turning a period of fragmentation and violence into the foundation for stability, legitimacy, and long-term dynastic authority. The conclusion of this narrative emphasizes the importance of both circumstance and agency in the emergence of the Tudor dynasty. Civil war created opportunity, but it was through strategic planning, cautious governance, and the guidance of figures like Margaret Beaufort that those opportunities were translated into lasting authority. Henry VII's reign, as both culmination and consolidation, reflects the ways in which careful management, alliance-building, and symbolic authority were necessary to stabilize a kingdom emerging from decades of conflict. The Tudors' legacy as peacemakers, restorers of order, and architects of a durable dynasty is inseparable from the lessons, challenges, and structures inherited from the Wars of the Roses. By understanding these connections, it becomes clear how the transformation from civil war to enduring dynasty was achieved, and how the combination of military, political, and symbolic strategies ensured the survival and legitimacy of one of England's most consequential royal houses.